Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Walls.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. First of all, happy Thanksgiving. We hope you guys all had a good Thanksgiving. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yep. So now that all the turkey, is pretty much wrapped up, and we're obviously in the leftover stage now, it's time to talk some more about NBA basketball. So for today, we got three teams we're going to talk about. We got the Houston Rockets, the Indiana Pacers, and the Memphis Grizzlies. So we'll start with the Houston Rockets, who, as of, we're recording this on, Wednesday before Thanksgiving, right? But either way, as of this point, the Rockets are 8-2 in their last 10. They're 13-6, good for third in the Western Conference, right? And so far this season, they've been balling, right? Now, a lot of it is at the defensive end of the floor. Although, to be fair, the offense hasn't been bad at all. And last season, it's kind of funny, right? Because if you remember last year, they started the year off really well because we talked about them early on as one of the surprises of the season, right? And, they kind of tapered off midway through. Then we know what happened, right? Then they picked it back up towards the end when Şengün went down. But, so far, 19th offensively, so not great, but not bottom 10. Very close, though. But defensively, second, right? Fourth in net rating. So that's kind of what you want to see. And you got a number of guys, that are playing really well. You got Alperen Şengün, right, who we talked about earlier in the season. He had like that first really good game, even though they lost, then kind of had a weird stretch. Now he's playing really well, right? He's averaging 19, 10.5, 5 assists. 47 from the field, 27% from three. But, he had a huge game the other night against the Timberwolves, right? Which was one of those NBA Cup games where, they were beating the brakes off of the Minnesota Timberwolves. At one point, they were up by, 18, 19 points. And then, like we kind of see in the NBA at different points, they came back. The Wolves did come back, had a little bit of a lead, and then the Rockets got it done on the defensive end to get it into overtime. And then they really got it done on the defensive end to close it out, right? Şengün closed it out. Van Vliet played really well. Jabbar's, a lot of guys for the team played well. And this is kind of also at the same time, you look at Jalen Green and he's kind of, his defense has been good, but it still feels like his offensive numbers just aren't where you want them to be, right? He's averaging 18 a game, 3 assists, 5 rebounds. That's fine. And I know the defense is good, but then 38 from the field and 30% from three. And in some of these games, they don't really close with him, right? He only played 23 minutes. And they were closing with, Amen Thompson, out there in his place, who made a big corner three in the game, which was kind of nuts to see. But, he had 15 points, 8 rebounds, 4 steals, 3 blocks. He's just been an absolute menace on that end. And, there's a lot to like about his game. And there's a lot to like about a lot of guys on this team, right? Because as we've already mentioned, Şengün doing what he does. Jabari Smith Jr. had, some stretches earlier in the season where he wasn't playing that great, and you look at his numbers and they're still not like amazing. Only at 12 points, 6 rebounds, 0.3 steals, and just not playing as many minutes. But the Rockets have so much depth that they have a lot of options, right? Like that game was a game where he was playing really well and they were able to close with him. And then there have been other games where, say, like Tari Eason didn't do much in this game, but he had been great in some of the other games prior to that. And even Dylan Brooks, right, had a pretty solid game. He had a couple of bizarre possessions at different points, but that's just kind of what happens. But either way, just kind of a wild thing to see, like, those two teams in different directions, where like the Timberwolves have really struggled in the last 10 games and they've lost 3 in a row, but the Rockets have been, on a tear. Again, they lost their game before, right? Because they lost to Milwaukee, but they're 8-2 in their last 10. And like you mentioned, there's a lot to like. And even then, like when you look at the schedule, yeah, some of the teams that they've played have been, not that great. But then there's other teams in the mix where, those are solid wins. Like, Minnesota's record isn't that great. But, like it's still, a good win, right? At the end of the day, like that's a win against like a team you're competing against in the West, right? Yeah, like, they got to win over Portland, but Portland's, they're not great, but they're not as horrible as we expected, although now they've had some injuries, but, you know, they've had some wins here and there. The Clippers, right? They're a good team. Knicks, they're a good team. So, there's a lot to like, and I think there could be ways for them to continue to improve, but you still kind of see in moments sometimes one of the issues of still not quite having a number one go-to guy just yet, because they did kind of get to the point where it looked like they were about to blow the game, because their main guys just weren't playing that well down the stretch offensively. But again, I think for them, the main thing is this is a tryout year. This is an opportunity for all these guys to show what they can do. And I think the guys that they really like, maybe they'll find a way to stick with. And then the guys that, are fine, but maybe not amazing, or maybe just aren't untouchable, if there's a guy that comes along, they might make a push to do it. They're not in a rush, clearly. And they're also, I just don't think is anybody really out there just yet, right? People talked about Giannis, but the Milwaukee situation's kind of normalized. And then people have talked about Durant, but, the Suns, when Durant has played, have been really good. So you're not really concerned about that. So, what are you kind of seeing from the Houston Rockets that's, making us, I think, pretty pleased with what we're seeing thus far? And I think this was a team that we thought would be decent, but I think they've been better than I think what we've expected.
Yeah, I think in the offseason, I think I picked the over for them, if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken. But um, through the 19 games that they've played, I think that's the number that they played. From what I've seen, I've really seen enough from the Jalen Green and Şengün experiment. I think they're going to be moving on from Jalen Green ASAP. So, very, very soon. Maybe not like the deadline, but probably like the offseason or something like that. Because I think
Hmm.
this game was kind of living proof that you don't really need him. Like you said, defensively, he's okay. But when he has games like this offensively, you're better off putting a guy like Thompson out there. And I think Thompson has been better throughout the season. I know, you're looking at counting stats and stuff, and you're like, well, his production is worse. Granted, he's getting, I guess, less minutes as well. So me personally, I'm higher on Thompson than Jalen Green at this point, and I know that might
Hmm.
be a little hot takey, but I just like what he's been able to do defensively. I think he fits the mold of what Udoka really wants this team to be. Elite playmakers that can also defend, and aren't going to be a liability on the court because, like you said, Jalen Green in the Minnesota game didn't even close. Only 23 minutes. So definitely a liability at times on both ends of the floor because his offensive game is so volatile, and at times his defense is kind of all over the place. But regardless, I think the pieces are there. I think you see flashes, like a Jabari Smith Jr. having a great game. I think that's kind of the ideal game you would want from him. Dylan Brooks even doing some things. Şengün also being the focal point. I think at this point, I've seen enough to the point where I believe that Şengün is the true number one. In this iteration of the roster. I don't think him being a number one is going to be sustainable down the
Hmm.
line. I don't think you can really build a championship team around a Şengün. I think you need to bring in or draft or trade for somebody else, who could be that big number one option. And Şengün could be an automatic W number two option, I think, for sure, because of what he's been able to do on the offensive end and how he sets guys up. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. And then also their depth is another reason why they've been so good. Thompson coming off the bench already is a plus for me. You have Jock Lando who's been okay. Tari Eason, I think at times, when he's on, it's pretty freaking cool to watch what he's able to do on the defensive end and also his athleticism. Reed Shepard, when he gets minutes, I have been thoroughly impressed with what he's been able to do. Hustle plays, just smart basketball plays and stuff like that. I do kind of wish Cam Whitmore was healthy, but I think that would kind of add to it. But overall, the team has been awesome and definitely deserves to be at this spot, taking advantage of, maybe some health issues that have happened in the West.
Yeah, exactly. And for Houston, this is the ideal start that you want. Is you want to, see them now progress to being able to actually win a lot of these games,
Yeah.
so that way you can really evaluate what you're seeing. And like you said with Şengün, right? He probably can't be a true number one, like you said, on a championship roster. But, for this version of the team, right, he could probably they could probably still be good, right?
Hmm.
I think obviously there's still, you know, just because you don't have like an all NBA level guy necessarily, right? There can be some problems like, just towards the end of the game offensively, but the defense seemingly is always going to be there. And, that's where, like you said, ideally, the best version of this team, like you said, is Jalen Green being like, an elite, guard on both ends of the floor. And then obviously Şengün kind of being the other piece with him. But it seems like he's probably just not going to be what you would like him to be. And that's probably the main reason why they gave him the contract they gave him, right? Because they re-signed both um Şengün and Jalen Green to, rookie extensions, but Şengün got a normal rookie extension, right? Like one that you kind of would just typically expect from, a guy who was, a first round pick who's played very well, right? I mean, he got what, like the normal 5 year extension, max extension that guys get. But Jalen Green's, you know, a 3 year deal, right? A 3 year extension with the final year being a player option. So that kind of already lets you know that, like you and I, they're not necessarily sold on the idea of him being, like the future piece of this team. But he's certainly like still good enough that he could probably easily be like, a centerpiece of whatever deal is out there. It's just the main thing is right now, I just don't think there's anything out there. And there usually isn't at this point in the season anyways. So, for them, like you just kind of do what you can, see how many young guys can play at a high level, and then kind of just go from there. So that's where I think this is probably more a summer thing. Maybe it could happen at the deadline, but who knows? With the new CBA, like these trade deadlines may just end up being kind of duds now, right? Because for some of these teams, they just may not feel like it's worth it to trade for, these, and not that he's on it just yet, but he will be next season, right? They may just not feel comfortable enough trading for those type of guys, right? Like, say, like a guy like a Brandon Ingram may just not be traded, right? He might just be a Pelican for the remainder of the season and then
Sure.
either resigns or, who knows? So, we don't really know what's going to happen there. But I think clearly, the Rockets, they have a lot of young talent and they've been building it for a while. It's just a matter of now they kind of have to get ready to start making decisions about which guys are going to be here long term. And some of those decisions will be made for them based off of which guys are playing really well and which guys just aren't, because you can't realistically pay and keep all these guys, right?
Yeah,
So
no
some
shot.
of these guys, yeah, like at one point, like a Jay Sean Tate, was like a quote unquote, piece for them back when they were not as good. And now he doesn't even really play at all, right?
Hmm.
Like, could he be like a guy that, is a role player for another team? Sure. But I'm just saying, like, that's how quickly these things can move in the NBA, right?
Right.
Not that people expected him to be a star or anything, but when he first came in, right, people were really impressed by his level of play. So, it's just kind of something to point out. But, um, I guess the main question is do we expect this level of success to continue? Because we know last season, right, they got off to a hot start, then it kind of levied off. They did have a number of injuries, to be fair, but, you know, I guess that's kind of the question is, are they for real this time where we actually expect them to not just win games, but win enough to actually make the playoffs, right? Like, do we expect them, are they actually a top 4 seed in the Western Conference, at least as a regular season team? Or, do we expect them to kind of sink down and then kind of be more so in the play-in spot and then either just miss the playoffs or, whatever. What do you think?
Well, I think as long as they win the must wins and the kind of free bingo scratch offs, I think they'll be okay.
Mhm,
Because kind of last year towards the end, they kind of tailed off and got caught up in the whole race for the what was it, 10th seed or something like that.
mhm,
So I understand, like people being skeptical about it, but I think if they win their must wins, and don't drop games like they did towards the end of the season last year, I think they'll be okay. Because the only reason they really got back into the whole race was because of that phenomenal win streak they had
yeah,
in March. But yeah, I mean, looking up the schedule, I mean, it doesn't look too bad. From my point of view, I don't know what like the actual strength of schedule is, but in my opinion, it doesn't look horrible. Granted, it's going to be harder than some teams in the East because of the fact that they're in the Western Conference, but I think it's for sure doable to the point where I could see them making it past the play-in,
mhm,
something like that. But And that's where they should be, I think, because
Yeah.
if that's the case, then that's an automatic green light to do whatever you want to do to improve the team next year.
Yeah, even if they're not like a top 4 seed, like you said, if they can get into the play-in and possibly compete for a playoff spot, then that's an improvement over last year. So
Hmm.
according to Tankathon, they do have the 11th toughest schedule. Now, again, in the Western Conference, like pretty much almost all of the Western Conference teams are the ones with the toughest schedules, aside from
Hmm.
like a couple. And these will change over the course of the season because for some of these teams, they'll catch teams like when guys are out. They'll catch teams as soon as guys come back. Maybe their own guys will be hurt, or
Yes.
teams will make trades or whatever. So like this stuff doesn't matter necessarily because there's still 60 plus games left for every team. But if we're talking about like their immediate upcoming games, right? Like they play the Philadelphia 76ers, right? So, later today. This is on Wednesday, right? But it's the shorthanded Sixers. So they should win that game in theory, right? Um then they play Oklahoma City. That might be a tough one. Then they play Sacramento. Then they play Golden State. Then they play the Clippers. So, they have a stretch of games that are a little bit more difficult. Then after that, then it levels out, right? They'll play New Orleans, but New Orleans will probably have more guys back, right? Because DeJounte Murray is going to come back. Um, you got Toronto, Charlotte. So, their schedule is a little bit tough coming up, right? Not a lot of like crazy easy games. So I think this next, month is probably going to give us a good idea of like what this team actually is, right? So say like over the next 4 or 5 weeks, if they're still, in a similar spot, then that probably gives us a great idea of like, okay, this team is legit. Because like we're still only a month into the season. And like we are kind of at the 20 game mark, which tends to get closer to, okay, this is probably what these teams actually are. But there's still, I think, an opportunity for some of these teams to kind of change spots because the standings are still very close, right? Like you had a team like, say, I don't know, the Lakers, right? Where they won 4 in a row, then lost 3 in a row and went from like the 3rd spot to the 6th spot, right? Or, a team like the Suns had a stretch where they fell down to like 7, 8 because of injuries. Now their
Yep.
guys are back. So they should probably, in theory, do better, right? Minnesota was up and then dropped, right, to like the 11th spot, right? So these things are still kind of changing. But, I think as long as you get, as long as like some of these guys each night can contribute on the offensive end, then they probably, because like say on a night where Jalen Green doesn't play well, you get Jabari Smith Jr., right? Maybe on a night where Dylan Brooks shoots horribly, then Tari Eason can make up for it. So I think they have the depth to continue winning because I think that's like a good formula for a regular season team. I just
Hmm.
think like come playoff wise, that's where they probably won't be able to do much as a playoff team. But that's not really the goal this season, like you said. The goal is to compete, see if you can compete for a playoff spot, and if you can, that's like the most successful season you could have with the roster you have in place. Because
Yeah.
that I don't necessarily know, like it wasn't expected even last season that they would be even in a remotely close position to compete for a spot. But they were able to get, like you said, get there towards the end. But now, hopefully this can be a little bit more sustainable. But I would
Absolutely.
like to see, I would like to see more offensively from Jalen Green, just because I think if you could get that right, then you could probably be really set as long as he's on the team. Because I just don't think anybody's, of those guys is going to get moved anytime soon.
Yeah.
But still, overall, good contributions from pretty much everybody that's playing consistent minutes, right? Like now you don't have to, be in a position where you kind of have to get bailed out by putting out like a Aaron Holiday or a Jeff Green, right? Those are veteran guys that maybe those guys could, in theory, get shipped, elsewhere, you know,
Yeah. And that's how deep
or
they
they just
are.
stay, or they just stay and just be locker room guys, right? That could easily be the case too.
Yeah. I think that's just a testament to how deep they are.
Hmm. So now we're moving on to talk about the Indiana Pacers. Right now, it had been a little bit since we had discussed them, and there was, they are 4-6 in their last 10. They have won 2 in a row, right? But obviously the talk of the town has been Tyrese Halliburton because of the fact that he has not had a great season thus far. He has been better in the last few games, so that's a good sign, right? I know obviously the biggest thing is when he plays at home, right? The stats are much better. When he plays on the road, stats are not very good, and he's had some really bad games this season at different points. Um, so obviously also for Indiana, they've also had some bad luck, right? Like they've had a bunch of guys go out due to injury that were kind of key pieces, right? Like Andrew Nemhard, Aaron Neesmith, right? They lost both of their backup bigs to torn Achilles, right? So now they've had to play Moses Brown. But obviously the crucial piece of this team is Tyrese Halliburton, right? If he doesn't play well, then it becomes a lot harder for Indiana to, get to where they want to go. Because again, he was having a really tough stretch where, like you mentioned, before we got on the podcast, right? Like some of these numbers, like, at Houston, 4 points, 8 assists, 1 for 7 from the field. At Toronto, 16 points, but 5 of 18 from the field. Um, you know, but then like when you're in Indiana against Washington, 21-9. In Indiana against New Orleans, 34 and 13 assists. So, these numbers, it's kind of bizarre. It doesn't seem like it adds up, but it's something that is going to have to kind of get sorted out because you can't have a scenario where you got basically like, 22-9 at home, 12-8 on the road. That's just something that can't necessarily happen. And I know he's had some type of back issue going on that's been bugging him, and that's probably a big part of it. Just because of the fact that when you got a bad back, there's not a whole lot you can do. It's just, they need him to really be, to take that step forward. Because last season, it's rough because he started last year on fire, right? Where he was playing like a top 5 player, basically, right? Then he had that injury and he kind of tapered off and never really was able to get quite back to what he was. Although he did have some big playoff games, right? So, but either way, it hasn't happened this season. And that's, I think, kind of the center of Indiana's struggles by and large, is when your best player is having a bad season, it becomes a lot harder to make up for that, right? Because, I mean, like even if we talk about, say, like points per game, right? Like, it's a big drop off for them, right? Compared to last season, right? Because they were the second best offense in the league last season, right? This time, they're 12th in points per game, and then even in offensive rating, they're 15th, right? Now, defensively, they're not as bad, right? Last year they were 24th, now they're 22nd, but they're significantly worse on the offensive end. And I just feel like a lot of that just kind of starts and ends with Tyrese Halliburton, even with them having a bunch of injuries to key guys. So, what do you kind of think about their struggles? And do you think that the last couple of games hopefully are a good sign that he'll be better? Or is it just kind of like maybe just an outlier and we just don't really know at this point?
I have a very, very, very hot take. I think they should
Mm.
shut him down. And
Okay.
the reason why is because I'm being a Halliburton fan, I know the timeline of what transpired from last year all the way up until the start of the season.
Hmm.
First of all, he got hurt. Then he rushed back, got hurt again.
Right.
Then went to Team USA, got hurt again. Same injury, by the way, 3 times in a
Yeah.
row. Comes into the season, didn't really have like a whole full off season to really rehab because he's been hurt the whole time and kept on re-aggravating the same thing. And then the whole back issue that doesn't help, so that adds kind of fuel to the fire. Um,
Hmm.
so just it's clear that he's playing hurt. You could tell if you watch Indiana games, the confidence isn't there, shakiness, indecisive, which is something that I think is very uncharacteristic of him because normally he's kind of 2 steps ahead of the opponent and is able to kind of be a little bit more decisive on his feet and on his toes. But yeah, it's been a disaster of a season for him personally, and I think it trickles down and definitely translate and shows in the Pacers record because granted, like you said, a lot of injuries all around at every position. You have guys out for decent stretches of time, but you still have solid depth pieces where it's like I don't think they should be dropping some of these games. And if Halliburton plays just a little bit more similar to what we saw from him last year, then I think those games would probably end up being W's, but instead they're L's because, like you said, 4 points is unacceptable from Tyrese Halliburton when you're kind of the centerpiece of the offense, and the team is quite literally built around what skill set you bring to the table. And if you're not bringing that skill set, then everything kind of falls apart at the helm. So my suggestion would be you're not going to see a turnaround out of Tyrese Halliburton until either the All-Star break or shut him down until he's fully healthy or close to fully healthy, because this version of him is not going to get you where you want to be, because you want to be a playoff team. And also, don't damage his career either. If you're Indiana, if there is something seriously wrong, then please shut him down. That's all I have to really say about it.
Yeah, and that's kind of probably the way that you might have to address it, where you may just have to kind of just sit out. Now, I don't know if they're going to do that. Like, I'm going to assume if he's like feeling like he can play, then he'll just play and just kind of play through it. But like you said, it's rough. It's darned if you do, darned if you don't, right? Because if he doesn't play, then it's probably going to be even tougher with all the injuries out, or with all the injuries that, they've had with their team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no, oh, Halliburton's out, but Nemhard can just kind of be there, right? With TJ McConnell, right? Or, other things like that.
Sure.
There's not as much of a plan B as they had last season. So
Right.
I don't really know, what you can do there, but it's probably, like you said, you're gonna have to probably kind of make the decision of, could this possibly just be like, maybe not necessarily a lost season, but more so just from the perspective of, is this something where we may just not be able to weather the storm? Because that's what happened last season, right? They kind of had to weather the storm a little bit while he was out, and they did all right because they had those other pieces, but they don't have that luxury this time around. So I just don't know if they're going to do that, So but but again, as we talked about, right? It all starts and ends with him. So
Mm-hmm.
if, like you said, they have had injuries, but if he plays well, right, then some of that doesn't really hurt you quite as much. But
Yes.
if, with him playing the way he's been playing, there's just not a whole lot you can do there. So, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to it. I just don't know if that's what Indiana's going to do, right? Like,
Yeah. I don't think
for
they
them,
will. That's why I called it a
yeah,
hot take.
yeah, yeah. Like, they do have their own first this year. So that's nice, right? So, like, let's say, and, not saying this is 100% going to happen, but, like, let's say they just have a bad year, right? And they miss the playoffs, or, they're in the play-in or something like that. They got their own first, right? They don't have it the following year, right? So, thank goodness it's not this year. But, so that's kind of something to factor in. But if you want to look around, the rest of the roster, I guess there are some other positives, right? Like Benedict Mathurin, right, has been a lot better, and since he's, come back from his injury from last season. Now, I will say he has kind of started to slow down a little bit in these last few games, but he did have some stretches where he was playing really, really well. As an additional scorer, and especially with all these guys out, you needed that additional scoring punch. So, it's kind of nice to see him, kind of get back into the swing of things, right? 18 games so far this season, 18 points a game, 7 rebounds, 49 from the field, 40 from three. So, that's good to see because, with Halliburton being a limited version of himself, that's where it's nice to have this type of scoring punch, especially with the other guys out. Walker still doesn't really seem like it's cut, like there's not really like a whole lot of a fit there, right? Like, and in addition, like he just hasn't been that good. Even some other guys, right? Like an Obi Toppin, I don't think has played as well this season. So the depth that you already have isn't playing as well. And in addition to that, some of the other guys that I think they were hoping to kind of slide in to
Yeah.
replace them have also not panned out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Walker's shooting 37% from three. That's nice. But I think you still kind of would like to see more. But again, it's just like, where's the fit? Because, you have Siakam as your starting four. Then you
Who's
have
been
Obi
awesome,
Toppin.
by the way.
Who's been really good. And that, again, that's another thing that helps with having Halliburton now, right? I mean, Siakam's even shooting really well from three. It's at
Mm-hmm.
45% on the year. So you got him at the four, and then you have Obi Toppin as your other four, and you just paid him. So, for Walker, it seemed like they were kind of thinking like maybe we can turn him into a three, but I just think that's probably just not as likely. I just think he's just more of a four. So
Yeah.
it probably just ended up just being a decision that probably didn't pan out, right? Where they did the draft thing. And again, like, yeah, he's in year 2. So it's not, like he's completely cooked or anything. But say like
He's
for
been
the
bad.
Wizards, right? Yeah, but say like for the Wizards and the Pacers, they did the draft day swap, right? Where like
Yep.
they, the Pacers drafted Bilal and the Wizards drafted Walker, and then they, swapped guys, and like,
Yep.
that's probably one that you might wish you could have back
Oh,
at
I'm
this
so
point.
happy. As a Wizards fan, I will gladly take Bilal over Jarace Walker 10 times out of 10.
hmm are there any other young guys like say, that look decent for, because I know Furphy was kind of playing a little bit because of injuries, but I mean, he was kind of, and he had like a few games where he was kind of forced to play, but it wasn't like he was playing like a ridiculous amount of minutes. So are
Yeah.
there other guys maybe to kind of get semi excited about, or is it just kind of like, it just seems like it's just not working?
I mean, a lot of them are hurt. Like
Yeah,
Ben
exactly.
Shepherd is hurt too, I think. Like
Yeah.
it's bad. Like that would be the guy that I think I would have my eyes on, say he wasn't hurt. Because I think,
hmm
you already talked about Benedict Mathurin, awesome. Nemhard's hurt. Like everybody's hurt. And it's like Jarace
Yeah.
Walker, you haven't really seen much from. Enrique Freeman doesn't really touch the floor. So
No, and he's a two-way guy anyways, I think. Not that he
exactly.
couldn't
So
play, but like, you know what I
yeah.
mean?
But like a lot of the guys just either don't touch the floor or like Jarace Walker just haven't really been that impactful to the point where I don't think they deserve like, a spotlight in terms of talking about them in a
Yeah.
positive way because I haven't seen anything.
Yeah. Like at the end of the day, they just have, they're kind of at a point where it's like they're starting to become too many guys out to such a degree where unless somebody's able to just kind of step in and make up for that, there just may not be a whole lot you can really do,
Yeah.
because like you're talking about two starters and a couple of bench guys, that are out. And, you know, they do have a lot of depth, so you do credit them for that. But even then, again, like we said, with Halliburton not playing as well, it stretched a lot more thin. So
Yes.
I just don't really know if I just don't really think there's a whole lot they can kind of do there. So they
No.
might just be have a stretch. This might just be a stretch where they may just not be able to do a whole lot, honestly.
Yeah, I think like you said, you either have to weather the storm or face the consequences and shut down Halliburton.
Yeah, so and I just and like you said, it probably is a hot take. I don't think they're gonna do that. Like I
It's
think
the
he's
right
gonna
thing to
try to
do in my opinion. I really
yeah,
think it's the right thing to do.
like I just think he's probably gonna try to play and gut it out. But like you said, it's rough because he just doesn't look the same, right? Like I don't think he just turned into just like, a fraud, a fluke, or anything like that. I think, like you
No.
said, I just think he's clearly not himself physically. And, like you said, when that happens, then there's just not depending on the injury, there's just not much you can do. It's not a whole lot you can do if you have a bad back. I mean, what can you do realistically?
Yeah, alongside a freaking bad hamstring too. Like that, it's
Sure.
bad. Like, and I don't understand where that sentiment of like he's washed and all this stuff is coming from because if you
I
look at his
think
two
he's
years, or it's like people have been saying like it's a fluke. It's like his 2 years in Indiana previously were awesome. Like he was pretty much
yeah,
doing the same thing.
I just think for him, he's just had some bad injury luck the last couple of seasons where, you know, he just hasn't been able to have a fully healthy. And like, it's hard to go through a season fully healthy, but
Yeah,
I guess and again, like you said, I don't really agree with the notion that his play is just a fluke. Like
yeah,
the only point that like they might just have is just like the swing in terms of like, the good version to the bad version of him, right? Like
sure.
say like there are some guys where if they're playing and they're not 100%, they'll still look pretty effective, but like you can tell they're not quite themselves. But then there are other guys where like their level of play drops off the moment that like they are, banged up, right? Where like they
Yeah,
just can't really do much of anything. Like
yeah,
it depends on who you are as a player. And like even for like a guard, right? Like you need that burst. You need that ability to kind of, you know, speed up, slow down, and things like that. And it just when you have those injuries, I'm sure it kind of just affects the reaction timing and everything. Like it you feel for the guy, right? Because it's just like he's a young player and he was playing very well. And last season, he kind of had to play through that injury to get that big extension or
yeah.
whatever.
All NBA. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And now he's still kind of dealing with a lot of the same stuff. So, it feels like for Indiana, it might just be tough. One last point on Indiana. So Miles Turner is in the last year of his deal. So how do we feel about his play thus far, right? Does he seem like, it's still, he's in a contract year, we don't know presumably Indiana might re-sign him and bring him back. Obviously their roster will get more expensive. But, what do we think about, his play thus far, right? Because especially considering he's basically been the only center other than Moses Brown to really
Yeah, I
play
mean,
at this point.
through 16 games, it's kind of similar to what we saw last year, just a little bit more efficient from three, which I kind of like. And he's always had that sneaky ability to space the floor and also be a very solid interior force and defender. So I've always been high on him, and I think he definitely deserves to get a contract. It's like you said, though, will Indiana be willing to do that? Considering the costs and expenses, but I think he's a
Mhm.
perfect fit. So I would want to bring him back if I was Indiana.
I think so too. It's just a matter of I'm curious to see what Indiana decides to do because if the season does go south and it goes sideways, you know, what decisions do they kind of make? Like, like you would think that their decision would probably just be, bad season, bad luck, injuries, just kind of run it back, bring the guys back. Like, and that's probably what I think they'll do. Is just kind of something, worthy of discussion because we know as this team progresses, we know you're going to get closer to that first apron, that second apron, and then as you continue to stay in there, it'll get a little bit more difficult. So there
Yeah,
are decisions that they're going to have to make because they can't keep and pay all these guys. But again, it's like we mentioned with the Houston situation. Some of those questions end up getting answered for you, right? Where like some guys will just play at a level where, okay, we know you're not a future part of our plans, right? Like say this is like say, for a guy like a Jarius Walker, right? So like let's say, knock on wood, hope it doesn't happen, but like let's say one of their power forwards gets hurt, right? Like say it's Siakam or Obi Toppin and he has to step in, right? And if he gets those minutes and he's playing really well, right, then you might have something there. But like let's say if he's still kind of struggling and still doesn't really look, the part, then that's kind of like okay, well, yeah, there's not a whole lot we can do there as we talked
right.
about. But that's the tough part and that's the tough part with these draft guys where it's like, sometimes they may just not pan out and sometimes they may just not be in the right situation. So he may not be in the right situation as of right now just because they have so many forwards and they don't really need any more fours, I guess. They don't really need any more fours. But, it still feels like, in theory, he should still have some element of like whether or not it's like small ball five or, like just kind of just gambling and having him at the three. Like it feels like there should still be something more there. But, so far, not really that impressed, I would
No,
say.
not at all. Nope.
Yeah. So now moving on to the Memphis Grizzlies, right? So the Memphis Grizzlies, this is another team that unfortunately has had another bout of injuries, but they actually have been able to hang on, right? This, again, if you look at this team, once again, John Morant's kind of been more out of the lineup than he's been in the lineup, right? Like he just recently came back, right, and had a crazy dunk um again, but he's played 9 games, right? And and the Grizzlies are what 11-7. So he's only he's missed 7 games, right? So he's missed no 18 games. So he's missed half the season already, right? So that's a decent chunk, right? Obviously, still a small sample size, but I think it is kind of impressive that Desmond Bain and Ja have missed, several games for this team. And even in some of the games that Desmond Bain has played, right, he was playing a limited role because he would just come back from injury. So even though it says he's played 11, it's not really like a typical 11 games. But I think that's kind of impressive that they've been able to still win these games despite their, two of their three best guys not really playing a whole lot. And that's kind of a testament to the level of depth that they've kind of been able to build back up, right? Like say you lost a guy like Tyus Jones a couple seasons ago, but now you've replaced him with like a Scottie Pippen Jr., right? Who's actually been able to kind of slide in for Ja, while he was out and was starting and he was playing great, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
even a guy, right? Like, and even a guy like, say, like a Jay Huff, right? Like, that's a guy that was, on the Lakers, that was like a Lakers two-way guy and bounced around a couple other teams. And, kind of looked in the G League looked like a solid prospect, but didn't really seem like he could really translate as much to the NBA. But he's been a good backup big for them, right? Like, and it's even more crucial because they've had other guys out as well, where like the injuries don't stop with just Ja and Desmond Bain, like Zach Edey, right? He's missed, a handful of games, right? I guess was that from the Draymond incident?
I believe so.
Yeah, exactly. So he's missed a stretch of games, right? Vince Williams Jr., that was the guy that had a, good year last year while all the other guys were out. He's going to be out for another month, right? After coming back and, not really being able to play a ton. So just the hits keep on coming for them, but they've been able to kind of hold on because they've still got a bunch of other guys that are playing really well, right? Like a guy like a Jalen Wells, right? Goes from, he was, a second round pick or whatever, and he's starting and he's actually fitting in and playing a really solid role, right? Even like a Marcus Smart hasn't played too much. Right. GG Jackson, as we talked about, that was a guy that played a lot last year, hasn't played at all because he had the foot injury. But a lot to like about a lot of the guys on this team, right? And that's just, kind of even a guy like a Santi Aldama, right? Like that's a guy that regardless of whether or not he's starting or coming off the bench, is finding a way to be impactful and effective, right? 13 and 8. And then, like a Brandon Clark, right? As coming back from his Achilles, he's I guess starting next to Jaren Jackson Jr. There's kind of elements which are just kind of weird where like sometimes you see him trying to take these threes and it just doesn't work for him, right? Like he's just so much more impactful around the basket. And then Jaren Jackson Jr. has been playing really well this season, right? Because obviously he's had to kind of play at different spots, right? With, their big man and wing rotation kind of being in flux. He's given them 23 and 6, 53 from the field, super efficient, 38 from three. So, this looks like it, when they're healthy, this could be a dark horse team, honestly, with the way the Western Conference has looked, where it doesn't really quite feel like there's a team that's pulled away just yet, right? Like OKC is one in the West. They have been banged up with Chet out, and Hartenstein just came back, so it could be them. Obviously, Phoenix, when Durant is healthy, has played well. But, the Grizzlies are not far behind, and that's with, their key guys being out, because some of these other teams have completely collapsed when their best players are out. But, for Memphis, they've been able to hang on, and, there's a lot to like, I think, when you see this team thus far. And like, even in points per game, like they're second in points per game because they have so many guys that they can just kind of slot out there and, just kind of find ways to get it done, right? They are seventh in offensive rating, fifth in defensive rating, sixth in that rating. So, so far they had a little bit of a up and down start, but now when you look at their, last stretch of games, looking pretty good. I mean, there's a lot to like, I think. And I think that's a testament again to, as we've talked about, the depth behind their star players that they were able to kind of build back up, because the depth was kind of starting to look really thin with some of the guys that they had a couple seasons ago, where like you lose Dylan Brooks, right? Zaire Williams doesn't pan out. But they've, kind of been able to reconfigure and retool, which is what you need to do, right? Because the core three guys we know are a really good core of young players, right? You just kind of have to continue to find the pieces around them, and it seems like they're kind of figuring stuff out. Because Zach Edey, which is another guy, right, which we have already talked about, like when he's healthy and he's played, he's he's been an impact player, right? Started off a little slow, but now he's kind of flashing a little bit of a 3-point game. You can see a lot of the mobility there. So there's before he got hurt, because I just looked at his game logs. His last game was against the Nuggets, right? So that's the game where I think he got hurt. But his minutes, he didn't play as much against Golden State, but the Denver game was his last healthy game. But prior to that, every game he was getting double-digit points, getting at least a block, several rebounds, and it's not like he's playing 35 minutes a game. I mean, his minutes a game is he's at 20. So, just all around solid play from a number of guys on this team, which is what you want. It's a good formula, especially for winning regular season games.
Yeah, I mean they have kind of refound their identity and replicated, the teams that had previous regular season success and experience. Like you talked about, Tyus Jones gone. All right, cool. We bring in Scottie Pippen Jr. Bang, that's our backup point guard. and then Zach Edey, the Steven Adams replacement, pretty much. And then you have Triple J back at the 4. Just everything seems to be clicking on all cylinders except for the health of the main guys, like you were talking about. But for them to overcome that adversity, I think speaks to their character and what they went through last year. Granted, not the same group of guys, but some of the guys who had to face that stuff are still on the roster as well. And then the new additions like Jalen Wells has been awesome. Like you talked about, Zach Edey was on a tear, and then the returners like Luke Kennard has been decent. I think. I know a lot of people hate Jake LaRavia, hate on him, but I think he's decent. He's been solid, in his minutes. So
Solid.
exactly. So a lot of these guys are really, I think, overproducing to the point where it's like, wow, you didn't really expect it out of all these guys, and yeah, they're sneaky deep for sure. And I think that is another reason why they are where they are, because with all the guys out and missing time, sometimes it's like you don't think they're gonna win a game, but then all of a sudden they get a crazy performance from like a guy like Scottie Pippen Jr. and he kind of carries them to victory alongside their stellar defense. Because I always thought the concern for me was going to be their offense. What does that look like? I
A
figured their
lot better.
defense. Yeah, I figured their defense was going to be solid and continue to be that way as long as you have the guys that you have. But offensively, they've looked really, really freaking good, and these guys can score at will and definitely in spurts and pretty much from wherever they want to. So that's really cool. And Santi Aldama has definitely been the unsung hero. And yeah, he's been able to slot into whatever position you want to put him in. The 3, the 4, or the 5. It doesn't matter. He does everything. And he can pass too. It's pretty cool actually.
Yeah, I mean, when we go back to their last, kind of healthy season, right? That was the year that they, um, were second in the West and they lost to the Lakers in the first round. They were 16th in or they were 16th in 3-pointers made, but like 23rd in 3-point percentage. So like that was not like a great outside shooting team, right? Even though they had the talent, which kind of, you look at the group of guys and it was like, Ja, not like a great 3-point shooter, right? Obviously, other than Jaren Jackson Jr., none of the other bigs were really stretch bigs, right? Like, Steven Adams, not really a floor spacer. Tillman really wasn't. Brandon Clark wasn't, right? And then, Aldama at that point was a little bit more raw, right? So in the playoffs, he didn't really do quite as much, right? And then Dylan Brooks had a very bad, shooting series and, was just not a really efficient offensive player for them, right? But last season, that was kind of where they had a much better, year from 3 in terms of makes, but that's because they shot so many and they were injured. They were still a terrible 3-point shooting team, and you don't really take any of their stats from last season into account at all because they had nobody half the time, right? But that's kind of the key here is that if their offense has kind of been patched up and they're still really good on the defensive end, I mean, you got like we said, like a really sneaky dark horse contender here, right? Because again, they're top 5 in defense, and then offensively, they're just outside of it. So, that's something that's really good because the year that they were good, they were 15th on offense. They were number 2 in defense, but they were an average offensive team, right?
Yeah.
This time around, a little bit worse on defense, but not by much. And then offensively, significantly better. So, if you're top 10 on both ends of the floor, you're kind of a contender, honestly, right? So we just need to see them healthy. I think if they can be healthy, they can really make some noise in this Western Conference, especially again when you kind of look at the rest of the West. And, I think the standings are a little bit different than what we kind of expected, right? Where like, teams like say, like, Golden State or Houston are towards the top, where I think a lot of people probably expected them to be a little bit lower, right? Whereas teams like Denver, Dallas, Minnesota, are closer to the bottom. Now, again, of course, these are all probably going to change. Some of these will balance out. But, for the Grizzlies, a lot to like thus far, right? And again, that's without Ja really even being incorporated a whole lot, right? Because, again, he's missed half the season, right? So,
Yes.
and in the games he's played, 21-9, 45 from the field, 29 from 3. But such a small sample size, if he can continue to be healthy and ramp up, he should probably get back to his, normal stats. Obviously, they'll probably dip a little bit just because there's more offensive talent to go around, right? Like, I don't expect him to average like 27 a game like he did, a few seasons ago. But, if he can get like somewhere around like 24, 25, and be a little bit better of a 3-point shooter, right? Essentially be close to an all NBA level guy. I think that should be able to get it done in terms of being a competitive contender, right? Probably not the favorites in the Western Conference for
Mm-mm.
sure, right? We don't really know who that is necessarily just yet, but again, they should be in the mix. I think, like their record isn't as good as Houston, but I think you'd be higher on Memphis than Houston
For
just
sure.
because of
They
the
have a
fact
little
that
bit
they
more
have more,
concrete stuff, yeah.
yeah, more a high end talent, and like you said, just a more established roster. But
Yeah.
I do like a lot of what I've seen from a lot of these young guys. So that's kind of the cool thing there. Is there a
Yeah,
young
for
guy
sure.
that like has impressed you the most?
I mean, probably Jalen Wells because second round pick came out of freaking nowhere. To be honest, like I like the pick. I
Right,
just didn't know what kind of productivity he was gonna have, XYZ stuff like
right.
that. I guess Scottie Pippen Jr. as well. I don't know if you want to consider him a young guy. What is he? 24? I guess that counts.
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy that was kind of like not really, looked at as like, he was. I don't think he was looked at as like a typical like rotational piece, right? He was kind of
No.
looked at more as like, he could be good. Like a lot of Laker fans did like him,
Hmm.
but we weren't really sure what he was actually going to be. But he's been good for them. I mean, again,
Yeah.
he's having a great season thus far. I mean, giving them 12 and 6, 48 from the field, 39 from three, and a pest on the defensive end too. Because I think that was kind of the main concern with him was because of his lack of size. Could he actually be an effective defensive guard? Because he's what 6'1" or so,
Yeah.
but he's been getting it done there. And obviously, they also have other good defensive personnel. But it's nice to know that like that's a guy that you can kind of put out there. Especially again, because like Marcus Smart is kind of supposed to be like a hybrid guy for them, right? Where like he can kind of have some ball handling and playmaking. And since he's been out, it's nice that you have all these guys you can turn to. But I like the Wells one. I think is kind of the one, him and Pippen are the ones that I think are more surprising, just given the
Yeah.
fact that like, we didn't know what Pippen was going to be, and then Wells because he was not like a first round pick, you didn't even expect him to really play. I think that's kind of
Exactly.
the main thing. Edie, I think, was the one that was polarizing more so because I think there were some people that were much higher on him, and then some people that were not as high on him, right? Like, I was kind of like in the middle where I thought he'd be solid, but I just wasn't quite sure how good he was going to be, and he's impressed me, right?
Yeah.
Like, even in my mock draft, I had him like a little bit higher. I didn't have him as a top 10. It was right outside of it. But, there were kind of some mock drafts that were kind of starting to show him dropping. But he's kind of, proven a lot of those guys wrong thus far. Because, I mean,
100%.
when he's out there, he's been, really effective, right? Especially just because of how mobile he is despite his size. And that was kind of the thing that a lot of people, were kind of trying to tell people, right? Like if people were kind of doubting him, that was the case that they were trying to make, that he's not like some slow, sluggish 7'4" guy. He's got some, movement to him.
Yeah. It's been really cool to watch this whole team. All the young guys, really. All Dama, too. All of them.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, obviously let us know your thoughts in the comments on these teams, thus far. So, I guess just kind of like one last quick, topic. Obviously, just, a standings check because we're about a month, basically a 20, game sample size in the season, close to it for a lot of these teams. And, again, as we've mentioned, there have been some surprises, right? Obviously, like, in the East, right? I think Cleveland being 17-1, that's a big surprise. I think the bigger surprise, even more so than that, also is Philly being 3-13, right there with the Wizards. Obviously, a lot of that is due to injury. Even then, I think you still didn't expect them to be as bad as they've been, and that's with Jared McCain basically being, like a rookie Steph Curry, basically.
Yeah.
Um, you know, some of the other in betweens is not completely shocking, right? Like, I think we expected teams like Charlotte and Toronto to be like somewhere in that lower spot, especially with the injuries that they've had, especially Charlotte. They can't catch a break, even with LaMelo Ball playing great. Atlanta started off hot and they've kind of tapered off. Now the Knicks, right? They're 7-3 in their last 10, so they're playing a lot better. Had a huge blowout win against the Denver Nuggets, right? A few days ago. So they're looking better. The Magic are 9-1. So, the East still kind of weird. Still a lot of teams that I think have been underwhelming, but it does feel like now we're starting to kind of get, a little bit of a formation of what it looks like.
Yeah, for sure. I think,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, like past the Knicks, I've been thoroughly disappointed with a lot of the teams that I guess people peg to be a little bit higher. Like I've been impressed with Chicago, Detroit, Brooklyn even, but like Indiana, Miami, Milwaukee, I've been thoroughly disappointed in. Compared to the Western Conference.
Yeah, and like there's still time for those teams to kind of catch up because they're
Yeah.
not, because like with Milwaukee winning 5 in a row, 7 of their last 10, they could catch up to the Knicks. But it just feels like the infrastructure, even with them playing better, still doesn't quite feel as good. Cleveland,
Hmm.
obviously, I think now they've kind of vaulted up to the team behind Boston as of right now, right? Just because I think they're 17-1. No matter how you feel about who they've played or how they've played against these teams, that's still a great start to the season.
Yeah.
So I think they've, at least for now, earned the right of, them being right after Boston. The West is the one that's a lot trickier just because of the fact that they have kind of a similar issue where there are teams that have underperformed, but then there's also teams that have overperformed. But so far in the West, it doesn't seem like there's been an established team that's like Boston in the East, where like I think we all kind of feel like Boston is the favorite in the East, even if you think that another team can come out of the East. Boston, I think, still seems like the favorite, and they just got Porzingis back, and he looked, pretty solid. After not having played since the NBA Finals, but the West is a little bit trickier. What do you think you're seeing, out there that kind of is intriguing? Because I think the West, we have OKC coming out of the West, but is there anything that makes you feel a little bit differently about what you've been seeing so far?
I mean, I think you kind of have to tip your hat to the Warriors. I know, kind of recently it's been but I think
Hmm.
in totality so far from what I've seen, it's been freaking cool.
Yeah.
A lot of things they're doing, a lot of things they continue to flex the depth, thing that they've been, taunting around and stuff like that. But yeah, Andrew Wiggins actually being an NBA player helps, and I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about last season, where it's like if his play tapers off, then that team probably won't do as well. But for him to kind of be replicating some stuff from 2022, 2023, that's a great freaking sign. That's a great sign. So for them to have some bounce back plays from guys like that is definitely helpful. So they continue to be the number 2 seed. I didn't think they were going to be number 2 right now. Uh,
Right.
no, that wasn't. I thought they were going to be 5 and 12,
Neither did
not
I.
12 and 5.
Neither did I, to
I
be fair.
Yeah, I thought they were going to be 5 and 12 because I thought Wiggins was going to be bad. I thought we might see a significant drop off from Curry. I just thought they were going to be worse overall, but they have completely proven me wrong. Houston, I feel like that's a big surprise for them to be number 3 at this point. Memphis
Mhm.
as well. Phoenix, I think that one is the one where it's like I just gotta see it in playoffs. I really don't care about the regular season for them. I expect them to be good. I expected them to actually be better, but injuries happen. But
Right.
I'm really waiting for the playoffs for them. Um, and I think the weirdest part of the freaking West is
Mhm.
that area of Minnesota, San Antonio, Dallas, and Denver. Like
Yeah.
that is such a weird grouping of teams because in theory you would think they're amazing teams, but
Right.
then
3 of those teams were, 2 of those teams were in the Western Conference Finals, and then the other one was the runner-up. And
right.
then the
So
other
for
one
them to
won
be
like
that
20
low is
games last
crazy. Yeah.
year.
So for all of them to be that low outside of San Antonio is crazy. I think that speaks volumes to what San Antonio's been able to do with their short turnaround. Granted, is it sustainable? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. But I think Dallas, Denver, and Minnesota have got to pick it up if they want to have a chance.
Yeah. So, and again, I think these things will kind of change and things will kind of balance out. But it is a little bit surprising, I think, to see because say like, at least for a team like, I don't know, at least like you said for Phoenix, they were up there and then they dropped because of the injuries. But say a
Mm-hmm.
team like Minnesota has been pretty healthy by and large this season, right? Like I think Mike Conley's really the only guy that's really missed, a decent amount of time, right? Through
Right.
the first, 17 games of the season for them. Denver, obviously, Jokic missed like 3, 4 games. And they, dropped all but one of those games, I think, right? Um, Dallas, right? Luca now has missed a few games and he's going to be out at least a little bit longer, right? And they've had some other front court guys, but even the Spurs, like they missed Wemby for like 3, 4 games and they still were able to win 4 in a row and might continue to win, because Devin Vassell is about to come back. Although he still can't play in back-to-backs. But yeah, I think the most surprising ones is the three of those four teams we mentioned were teams that we assume were going to be three of the four best teams in the West. And so far, they haven't looked the part, right? Like they've had maybe flashes of what they could be, but for the most part, it's been kind of just not really that great. But I think that they'll be better. I think Dallas, when Luka comes back, if his numbers, get better, I think they will be better. I hope Minnesota will be better, but I don't really know for sure. And
Right.
then Denver, like they will probably, I get, when Aaron Gordon comes back, they should be better. So that's kind of another key piece. But then the issue is Jamal Murray just hasn't been himself. So, that's, and if he's not himself, then yeah, I don't really know, right? Like he had a
Yeah.
quote the other day, right, where after they lost to the Knicks, they were like, yeah, we stayed in LA, and obviously like we beat LA, and it's like, okay, all right.
I mean, that's their
It's kind
Super
of
Bowl,
weird.
man. That's their Super Bowl.
Yeah, but yeah, either way, we'll see how this goes. But this concludes this episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about these teams. That we discussed, right? Which ones you've been impressed by, which ones, you're not as impressed by, which ones do you think maybe we're just wrong on or right on? Obviously, also let us know, your thoughts on the standings thus far, which, we're not going to talk about them every episode, right? We'll probably, kind of mention them every couple of weeks just to kind of see where things are at as, these things often change. But, again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know, how we're doing and things like that. Obviously, continue to help this channel grow. We'll see you in the next episode and hope you had a great Thanksgiving.